welcome to Chili's. Honestly, I'm amazed that you clicked on this because I feel like at this point, no one wants to talk about climate change. It's not a fun conversation. It's like you have a free Sunday afternoon, it's beautiful outside, and you go, hey, you know what? I want to take a cold bath right now. Just be naked and uncomfortable for 20 minutes. That sounds nice. You ever think about when we're getting ready to retire, it'll be 2060, and there'll be hundreds of millions of climate migrants around the world, and the global economy will be permanently crippled? You ever think about how giving birth to children right now is kind of an ethical gray area, considering that their adult lives will be very uncomfortable, resources will be scarce, and even if they do get by okay, they'll have to live with the guilt of witnessing billions of impoverished people around the world die? I'm very fond of parties.
The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
Americans are so bad at confronting the seriousness of climate change, it makes my blood boil, no pun intended. Literally, look at how Congress responded to the Green New Deal last March.
I've noted with great interest the Green New Deal, and we're going to be voting on that in the Senate. We'll give everybody an opportunity to go on record and see how they feel about the Green New Deal.
Not only are Tauntauns carbon neutral, but according to a report a long time ago and issued far, far away, they may even be fully recyclable.
This is serious. This should not be a partisan issue.
How in the world would you have a bone to pick with the Green New Deal? It's literally just a proposal that says what would need to happen in America in the next 20 years to get to zero emissions, which is our only hope for preventing the collapse of human society. But it also acknowledges that we can't pull some elitist liberal milquetoast shit like Macron did and make working people go broke over carbon taxes. Rich people already have a climate change plan. Want to guess what it is? Having all the money and power in the world.
Could you share with us briefly the vision of Blue Origin and the idea of kind of space tourism with renewable rockets?
Super important to me. For many decades, I believe, and I get increasing conviction with this with every passing year, the Blue Origin, the space company, is the most important work I'm doing.
From when I was in college, there were three areas that I thought would most affect the future of humanity. One was the internet, another one was sustainable energy, and the third was space exploration.
This could be an escape hatch for rich people.
No. I'm not really going to talk about climate science or policy in this video. I want to focus on climate denial. If you're watching this right now, you probably think that you aren't in denial about climate change. What the fuck? We live in a culture of climate denial, and every day we're using defense mechanisms to block and negate what climate change really means to our lives. In the 1960s, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book called On Death and Dying, studying how terminally ill patients psychologically cope with the reality of their own impending death. From this, we got the widely known 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That's right. Climate denial is the first in a 5-stage process of grief. If you're still in denial, get well soon, sweaty. You can believe in climate change, but still be using defense mechanisms to live in denial about it. Denial isn't rational. It's an instinctual stance our psyche takes against reality. And, at least in the US, denial happens to be quite profitable. David Wallace Wells wrote this article, which became a book that I highly recommend. It's called The Unhabitable Earth. In it, he talks about how, after 2008, a growing number of historians started studying something called fossil capitalism, suggesting that the entire history of swift economic growth, which began somewhat suddenly in the 18th century, is not the result of innovation or trade, but simply our discovery of fossil fuels in all their raw power, a one-time injection of new value into a system that had previously been characterized by global subsistence living. Can you shut up, Felix? Felix, you can't meow during my video. Are you in denial about climate change? Okay. So if you're looking at the timeline of fossil capitalism, it would start basically at 1800 and go up to today. In 1859, a scientist discovered that the emissions from coal blocked the transmission of heat waves. In 1963, scientists began discussing the possibility of global warming caused by the reaction between water vapor and CO2. And by 1971, there was a publicly acknowledged consensus among scientists that the burning of fossil fuels posed a long-term threat to global temperatures. 1971 was 48 years ago. See, this is why young people can't stand old people. What the f***? fuck were you doing in 1971? Smoking bad weed? Burning kids alive in Vietnam? Guess how old Dianne Feinstein was in 1971? 38 years old. And guess what? She was already a politician. How are you going to chastise kids for wanting the Green New Deal when you had your entire wretched political career to prevent this from being necessary in the first place? Old people have had so much time to gently bring an end to fossil capitalism. And what did they do instead? Oh, right, they sent us to war with oil nations in the Middle East for 29 years and counting. Since 1971, we have emitted well over half of the CO2 that is in the atmosphere today. Over half of the damage that we've caused to the planet, we did knowingly. This brings us to our first mechanism of denial, reaction formation. Reaction formation is the fixation in consciousness of an idea, affect, or desire that is opposite to a feared unconscious impulse. A mother who bears an unwanted child, for example, may react to her feelings of guilt for not wanting the child by becoming extremely solicitous and overprotective to convince both the child and herself that she is a good mother. When you're dealing with a reality that your ego isn't able to confront head on, you'll act out in an exaggerated way that opposes that reality. Basically, there's a little voice in your head that's saying, people think you're a coward because you're only 5'2". No, they don't. Hey, who wants to invade Russia? My name's Napoleon Bonaparte, by the way. So if we do live in a culture of climate denial and we are using reaction formation as a defense mechanism, it would make sense that we'd be ramping up our consumption to a degree that would seem absurd.
You like my hair? Gee, thanks. Just bought it. I see it. I like it. I want it. I got it. Yeah, I want it.
Hey, Mr. Beast here. Today we're gonna buy every item in this store. Let's do it.
I also got this shirt. I love this. It's so cute. It's just this white cropped polo shirt.
These are the off-white mirror shorts that came out this year. They were literally like a lot of money.
I'm more of an Android guy than I am an iPhone guy, but I've always carried an
Flashes
iPhone
on for a
and an
mineral
Android.
that DRC has in great abundance, cobalt. It's a critical ingredient in lithium-ion batteries which power smartphones and laptops.
Capitalism would have you believe that your only barrier to consumption is how much money you have. And I know what you're thinking, but wait, don't millennials not care about material things? Don't we prioritize experiences over having stuff? Yeah, you think airplanes are carbon neutral? No. They add 815 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year, and air travel is projected to double in the next 2 decades. Everyone's new favorite thing to do is trot the globe, burning fuel with abandon, hanging out at resorts, splurging on imported food, going to see live bands and comedians that are burning tons of fuel to tour around the country. Despite decades of noble sacrifices by bourgeois liberals, recycling, drinking soy milk, buying carbon offsets, the world has not slowed down in its emission of CO2. We know what the problem is. We know that individual lifestyle choices aren't going to stop the machine of fossil capitalism, but instead of facing that, we exaggerate opposite realities. Brands like Starbucks, Whole Foods, Goop, Madewell, and Tom's have banked their success on the lie that consumer choices have anything to do with the ethics of fossil capitalism. Instead of actually embracing substantive structural change to the economy, libs have wasted their time cosplaying as eco-warriors for social clout. Again, it's unnecessary, it's exaggerated, and when you take a step back, it's absurd. I know I sound critical, but hey, it's not a big deal. All of this is good fun. It's theatrical, it's glamorous, and while we have access to nice things, we might as well enjoy them. When President AOC rides into town and makes me become a vegan, I'll be thrilled. Until that happens, I'm not going to waste my time feeling guilty about an economic system I didn't create and have no material power to change. So in the climate denial power rankings, which by the way, I am including in this video, reaction formation definitely gets an A. It's great. And besides, the rise of global emissions in the past 50 years has had a lot to do with the industrialization of developing countries, which is a whole nother can of worms. Hey, speaking of worms...
We're taking care of ourselves for a change, folks. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. National. Nothing. Use that word.
Oh my god. You people have like worms in your brain, honestly.
Imagine being in an auditorium, listening to a respected expert give a talk about some topic you find important. Then, out of nowhere, someone from the outside of the auditorium starts banging as hard as they can on the doors. At first, the speaker tries to continue talking, but the banging gets louder and more desperate. You can imagine the room surging in anxiety as security gets called to handle the disruptor. Then, imagine that every door in the auditorium starts getting banged on all at once. Of course, panic would ensue. No one would have any idea how many people are outside and what they want. This is the defining experience of repression-based anxiety, the feeling of something you don't understand pounding on your front door, a faceless outsider disrupting your grip on reality. This is why therapists will teach you how to label your feelings, talk about the defining traumas of your childhood, draw as many connections as possible between the past and the present. We can never excavate every repressed element in the unconscious, nor should we. But by using language, dreams, jokes, archetypes, we can clear blockages between the unconscious, the superego, and the ego, and gradually become more gracious, conscious managers of our own minds. In the very snide and elitist way the left loves to operate, we've come up with all sorts of diagnoses for the nationalist right. Some chalk it up to quintessential racism. Some like to see it as economic anxiety stupidly misplaced onto immigrants. Some blame it on tech companies, automation, global trade, treacherous neo-Marxist Jews. And look, I'm not here to make a diagnosis. You have to remember that I'm pretty dumb. But I want to just pose a fun thought experiment. What if this recent uptick in white anxiety, not just from the US, but in France, Italy, the UK, Poland, Germany, all stem from a repressed fear of climate change? Let's do some psychoanalysis on Trump's banner line. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. So immediately we have an obvious lie that Mexico doesn't send their best. They do send their best, if there were a way to quantify such a thing. Lots of acclaimed Mexican artists, scientists, writers, actors come to the United States. They teach at universities. They make George Clooney and Sandra Bullock look like astronauts. So what does Trump think is wrong with America that Mexico wouldn't be sending its best? Putting my psychoanalyst hat on, I'd say that Trump seems to be repressing some shame about the United States, a shame that he can't acknowledge, but shows through the cracks of his worldview. Point of anxiety number 1, bad people are attracted to us because we are secretly bad. So then in the second part of that statement, Trump is conflating two racist archetypes, the mule and the predator. Trump's germophobia is on full display here. These immigrants are sneaking things in and then non-consensually penetrating us, infecting us with their drugs and crime. Point of anxiety 2, there's something bad out there that's spreading towards us, and migrants are symbolic carriers of that unlabeled badness. And you can apply these two exact irrational points to Trump's other flagship issue in 2016, the Muslim ban. There's Muslims all over the world who want nothing more than to punish us, and if they want to come here, then we should be suspicious of that. Refugees from the Middle East are secret carriers of death and destruction. They're not leaving it behind, they're secretly bringing it with them. So now that I've laid that out, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Trump is triggering anxieties about the global destabilization of climate change caused by America's century-long brigade of fossil capitalism. We don't call the migrants currently at the border climate refugees, but we should. Central America has had dramatic changes in rainfall patterns over the past decade, resulting in a collapse in subsistence farming, which has driven northward migration. The Syrian civil war was triggered by a drought that's been linked directly to climate change. As temperatures rise, migrants will continue to flee countries that have been destabilized by water and crop shortages, moving to wealthy countries where temperatures are cooler. Us. That's us. So when you look at it this way, climate denial isn't a sub-effect of Trumpism. Climate denial is Trumpism. Everything about his appeal leads back to climate denial. It's not a coincidence, for example, that the nostalgia Trump pulls on is from America's peak era of fossil capitalism, 1950 to 1970. American industry was booming, the middle class had never been wealthier, and no one was concerned about the long-range effects of climate change. MAGA is nostalgia for a kind of guilt-free American brand of exceptionalism where there's nothing shameful or harmful about maximizing one's material success. This is why Trump's many scandals have only boosted his popularity. Every time they happen, it's an opportunity for Trump to solidify the narrative that he, and by proxy the rest of us, have nothing to feel guilty about. This is symbolic climate denial par excellence. And yes, I did Google that phrase to make sure I was using it correctly. Your time is precious, so I won't rant for too long about how fucking useless and cowardly this worldview is. In the power rankings, repression as a mechanism gets a big fat F. Instead of processing their anxiety, nationalists are picking these stupid symbolic fights that mean absolutely nothing. For example, in New Orleans a few years ago, they finally decided to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee because, it was put there to intimidate black people. And people were protesting, saying, "You can't erase history. I'm proud of my heritage." How is keeping this statue a priority for you when New Orleans probably won't even exist by the end of the century? It's like if your house was on fire and your wife was like, "Come on, Rick, we gotta go." And you're like, "1 second, I'm rewatching season 2 of Happy Days. You can't erase my culture." Sometimes I forget how fucked up the 20th century was. First you had World War I, which killed 16 million people, thanks mostly to the industrial advances of warfare. And then you had World War II, which killed another 70 to 85 million people. And as we all know, the most significant reaction to the insanity of the past century was the invention of superheroes. Superman, Captain America, Batman, Spider-Man. You know what superheroes are. Superheroes have been around since the 30s, but they really took off during World War II. In 1943, 25 million comic books were sold every month. It's telling that in the mid-1940s, there had to be a cap on comic book sales because the war was causing paper shortages. Comic book superheroes began as a means to entertain children with undiagnosed learning disorders. And now they're the subject of, every movie that's been made since 2000. If you've been paying attention to any part of this video, I'm guessing you know what I'm about to say. Superheroes are a fantasy of American exceptionalism in the face of world-ending evil. And for me, an excellent opportunity to talk about displacement. In Freudian psychology, displacement is an unconscious defense mechanism whereby the mind substitutes either a new aim or a new object for goals felt in their original form to be dangerous or unacceptable. The classic example of this is the father who gets belittled at work, so he comes home and he takes his anger out on his kid, and then the kid takes his anger out on the family porcupine, and the porcupine's like, "Hey, don't displace your anger onto me, brother." When you look at pop media as a landing place for our feelings, 3 displaced emotions stand out: violence, lust, and hopefulness. In a time where Americans have never had less sex, been less violent, and had less hope for their actual lives, all 3 of these emotions have never been more on display in Hollywood. Displacement shows up in all kinds of ways, but in the past few decades, climate anxiety has become a major part of the mix. Similar to World War II and the Cold War, we're being inundated with stories about superheroes who have what it takes to save the world from total annihilation. Take the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for example. The arch-villain of the MCU has been Thanos thus far. Basically, Thanos' whole deal is that his planet is facing extinction due to overpopulation, and he was concerned about this issue and he decided the only solution was to murder half of the population. It was a dumb idea. I guess he's not aware that populations grow back, and I guess he was banished for having it. But then his home planet ended up collapsing due to overpopulation. So now Thanos has dedicated his life to murdering half the population of other planets and ideally the entire universe. It's easy to see this as a sort of mixed up parable for climate change, where Thanos is a symbol for climate change, even though his enemy is also kind of climate change. But we have to be careful here. Displacement is still a mechanism of denial, and any of these movies that are tacitly approaching the existential threat of climate change are also rerouting the problem, so that none of our animus in the movies actually translate into real life. And I guess I need to step back and say, we have every right to be angry in our real lives about climate change. At the risk of YouTube banning me, we probably have the right to be violent about climate change. Yeesh. But we're not, because it's much easier and probably healthier not to be. So we try not to think about it, and we watch these Hollywood movies where humans triumph over the threat of global annihilation, where the target of our rage is condensed into a singular, defeatable villain. But of course, that's not how the real world is. It's not like if we pass the Green New Deal, we're gonna knock climate change out and save humanity. We're in denial because we're already past the point of no return, if there ever was one. I mean, at best, our job at this point is to mitigate the disasters of the future. Fossil capitalism is coming to an end whether we want it to or not. What we have to decide is whether we want to pull the brakes ourselves or if we'd rather have it crash and burn and kill everyone on board. So, in the power rankings, I'm going to put displacement at a B. We displace our rage, our fears, and even our hopes away from reality so we can get through the week. I have the luxury of getting to sit around and worry about the end of humanity for hours on end. Other people are busy, they've got actual shit to do, and if you'd rather displace your feelings than deal with them, more power to you. I've really put myself through hell making this video. It took forever. I've been drinking more. I have had entire days where I'm just mad and depressed, and I feel like I can't bring myself not to be hopeless. Basically, I've gone and green pilled myself, and if I could go back in time and avoid making this video, maybe I would have. But the silver lining here is that there are actual things you can do that'll help you feel better. Our culture provides all kinds of band-aid solutions and meaningless outlets to stay in denial, but if you think outside the box and come up with creative solutions, you can move past denial and eventually land in acceptance. There are literal therapists that you can go to that specialize in global warming depression. You should just be going to therapy anyways. It's good for you. I'm not in therapy right now because I don't get how my health insurance works. You can organize with people in your community who also care about this and want to push real solutions forward. Or, just as a random third example, if you're a degenerate 22-year-old layabout with way too much time on his hands and a working knowledge of GarageBand, you could produce a surprisingly hard diss track against climate change and then use that diss track as an escape hatch from the very long-winded and debatably pointless video essay you just made. Bro, you know climate change is fucking real. CO2 in this bitch makes it hot in here. Spitting fire on the track like it's jet fuel. We turn it up in this bitch, call it hell soon. Don't tell me to recycle, we're off that. Spending all my damn money on some ice packs. The 1% don't give a fuck and that's straight facts. Let the whole planet burn while they count stacks. And if you think they're gonna help, then you're dreaming lucid. 40 years, catch all the little fishes cooking. Polar bears losing weight like John Goodman. If you're still in denial, then you're fucking stupid. Bitch, we gotta do the Green New Deal. Yeah, that's corny, but you know I'm being real. How you think a baby's kid's gonna fucking feel that we didn't do shit and let them get killed?